They told the world the case was over. They said the story ended in a jail cell. But what if that was only the beginning? What if the real power wasn't in one man, but in the names, the institutions, and the sealed documents still hidden from public view? Tonight, we're opening the Epstein Files Part 2. And what you're about to hear was never meant to stay in headlines. When the first batch of court documents began to surface, there was no dramatic music, no breaking glass, no cinematic explosion of truth. There were only scanned pages, black text on white backgrounds, filled with redactions, legal language, timestamps, and names that had once floated effortlessly through elite circles. Yet those pages carried weight. For years, speculation had thrived in the absence of documentation. Now, pieces of the record were becoming visible, and visibility changes everything. The story had already shaken the world once. A wealthy financier with connections spanning politics, academia, business, and entertainment had been arrested and charged with federal crimes related to trafficking. His death in federal custody had fueled global controversy, distrust, and countless questions. But after the headlines faded, the legal machinery continued moving quietly. Civil lawsuits progressed. Appeals were filed. Judges reviewed sealed motions. Victims pursued accountability through the courts. And eventually, portions of previously confidential material were ordered unsealed. Unsealed does not mean explosive. It does not automatically mean criminal revelations against every name mentioned. Legal documents are precise. They record allegations, depositions, sworn statements, motions, and responses. They list people who were contacted, introduced, present, or referenced. They preserve testimony exactly as given. And that precision matters, because when documents become public, interpretation begins. Many people expected a simple list, a definitive catalog of wrongdoing. Instead, what emerged was more complicated. Names appeared in various contexts, some as social acquaintances, some as professional contacts, some mentioned only in passing. In civil litigation, individuals can be named in depositions without being accused of crimes. That distinction is crucial, yet often overlooked in online discussions. The legal system separates association from culpability, and the released files reflected that complexity. Still, patterns began to draw attention. Travel logs, appointment books, and testimony described the financier's unusual access to powerful spaces. Private jets connected cities across continents. Residences in New York, Florida, New Mexico, and the Caribbean were referenced repeatedly. He appeared comfortable in elite company, attending academic gatherings, philanthropic events, and private meetings. For someone whose financial background was often described as opaque, his social reach was remarkably transparent. The documents also revived scrutiny of the 2008 plea agreement reached years earlier in Florida. That agreement allowed him to plead guilty to state charges and avoid federal prosecution at the time, resulting in a sentence widely criticized as lenient. Federal prosecutors later described it as a serious failure of justice. Victims argued they were not properly informed under federal law. The legal debate over that deal would echo for more than a decade, culminating in court rulings acknowledging procedural violations even though the agreement itself remained intact. When the financier was arrested again in 2019 on federal charges in New York, the case appeared poised to examine not only his alleged conduct, but also the broader system that had allowed it to continue. Prosecutors alleged a pattern of exploitation spanning years. Defense attorneys challenged aspects of the case. The public watched closely. Then came his death in jail, officially ruled a suicide by the medical examiner, accompanied by acknowledged security failures at the detention facility. Broken cameras, guards who did not perform required checks, administrative irregularities. The Department of Justice conducted internal reviews. Conspiracy theories multiplied. Trust eroded. Against that backdrop, the release of additional files felt significant. They did not rewrite history overnight. They did not produce dramatic courtroom confrontations broadcast live, but they added texture. In depositions, witnesses described social environments that blurred personal and professional boundaries. Some individuals stated they had limited interactions. Others said they regretted associations once allegations became public. A few acknowledged having flown on private aircraft but denied awareness of misconduct. The nuance mattered, even if nuance rarely trends online. Financial documents included in broader litigation revealed donations to universities and research institutions. The financier had cultivated relationships within academic communities, presenting himself as a patron of science and innovation. Several universities later reviewed and, in some cases, returned funds connected to him. Internal investigations examined how relationships had formed and whether warning signs had been missed. Institutions confronted uncomfortable questions about vetting donors and balancing ethical responsibility with financial opportunity. As journalists analyzed the unsealed materials, they emphasized a recurring theme. Proximity to power can create insulation. Not immunity in a legal sense, but social insulation, a reluctance to challenge someone who appears connected and influential. Over the years, multiple journalists had attempted to investigate aspects of his background. Some stories stalled. Others faced legal threats. It is difficult to quantify how influence shapes coverage, but the perception of influence can be powerful in itself. Another layer of complexity involved civil settlements reached with victims. Several cases concluded with confidential agreements, limiting what could be discussed publicly. While settlements can provide compensation, they can also reduce the amount of testimony aired in open court. This dynamic contributed to public frustration. Many wanted a sweeping trial that would expose every detail. Instead, legal proceedings moved incrementally, governed by evidentiary stand and procedural safeguards. The unsealed documents also highlighted the role of longtime associates. One associate, later tried and convicted in federal court, faced charges related to facilitating abuse. That trial provided additional testimony and brought renewed attention to the broader network of relationships. Yet even there, the legal focus remained narrow: specific counts, specific dates, specific actions. Criminal law demands precision. It does not operate on implication. Public discourse, however, often does. Social media amplified interpretations at extraordinary speed. Screenshots of partial pages circulated without context. Redactions were viewed as proof of deeper secrets. Some commentators treated any mention of a public figure as evidence of guilt, while others dismissed the entire matter as exaggerated. The reality lay somewhere between those extremes. A documented pattern of abuse acknowledged by courts, surrounded by a complex web of associations that required careful analysis rather than assumption. For victims, the unsealing process carried emotional weight. Many had spent years fighting to be heard. Each document release validated parts of their experiences, yet also reopened painful memories. Advocacy groups emphasized that the core issue was exploitation and accountability, not celebrity name-spotting. They urged the public to focus on systemic reform, stronger reporting mechanisms, clearer oversight in institutions, and better protections for vulnerable individuals. Legal scholars analyzing the case noted broader implications. The controversy surrounding the 2008 agreement prompted discussions about prosecutorial discretion and transparency. The jail death triggered reforms in detention oversight procedures. Universities revisited donor policies. These changes did not erase past harm, but they reflected institutional responses to public scrutiny. As the dust settled from the latest document release, one truth became clear: transparency is rarely satisfying. It unfolds in fragments. It reveals as much about systems as about individuals. The unsealed files did not offer cinematic closure. They offered documentation, imperfect, redacted, sometimes ambiguous, but undeniably real. And perhaps that is the enduring lesson of this chapter. The story is not sustained by mystery alone. It is sustained by records, court filings, testimony, financial trails, oversight reports. Each piece contributes to a larger mosaic that scholars, journalists, and the public continue to examine. Session 1 ends not with a shocking revelation but with a deeper understanding. The pursuit of accountability moves slowly through institutions that are methodical by design. The documents may not answer every question, but they ensure that the questions themselves remain on record. And in cases involving power, influence, and systemic failure, the record can be the most powerful force of all. When investigators look at major criminal cases involving long-term operations, they often focus not only on people but on infrastructure. Infrastructure reveals planning. It reveals resources. It reveals intent. In this case, the properties themselves became central to understanding how everything functioned for so many years without full public exposure. The financier at the center of the case did not operate from a single office or residence. Court records, testimony, and reporting over the years described multiple high-value properties. A Manhattan townhouse considered one of the largest private residences in New York City, a Palm Beach estate in Florida, a ranch in New Mexico, an apartment in Paris, and a private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Each location served a different purpose socially and logistically, but together they formed a network of controlled environments. The Manhattan townhouse stood out immediately to investigators after the 2019 arrest. Federal agents executed search warrants there and reportedly removed hard drives, CDs, photographs, and documents. Prosecutors later referenced large quantities of digital material recovered during the search. The house itself was described in court filings as containing surveillance equipment and security features. While not illegal in itself, the presence of extensive recording systems raised questions that would echo long after the case stalled. Palm Beach represented an earlier chapter. It was in Florida that the original investigation unfolded in the mid-2000s, leading to the controversial 2008 plea agreement. Police reports from that period documented witness statements and patterns of alleged recruitment. That property became symbolic of what critics described as missed opportunities for stronger prosecution at the time. The physical space mattered because it demonstrated that allegations were not isolated incidents but repeated behaviors within a consistent location. Then there was the ranch in New Mexico. Less publicly discussed in early media coverage, it nonetheless appeared in flight logs and property records. Its remoteness contributed to the broader narrative of controlled access. Large properties in secluded areas allow for privacy by design. Privacy itself is not criminal, but in this context it intensified public suspicion once allegations became widely known. The private island, however, attracted the most attention. Officially part of the U.S. Virgin Islands, it was owned through corporate structures connected to the financier. The island featured multiple buildings, guest houses, staff quarters, docks, and a private runway capable of handling small aircraft. Court documents and civil complaints referenced travel there. Flight logs that had been entered into evidence in earlier proceedings showed repeated trips by various individuals, including staff and guests. The existence of a runway eliminated the need for commercial oversight. Travel could occur discreetly. Logistics require coordination. Pilots must file flight plans. Maintenance crews must service aircraft. Staff must manage properties. In testimony across multiple cases, employees described structured routines. Some said they were unaware of alleged misconduct. Others described unusual restrictions placed on certain areas. Civil lawsuits in the Virgin Islands later alleged that corporate entities connected to the financier facilitated operations by managing payroll, maintenance, and financial transactions. Those cases resulted in significant settlements with the estate after his death. The estate itself became another layer of complexity. Following his death in 2019 at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York, the financier's assets were placed under legal administration. A compensation program for victims was established, funded by the estate. The program paid out hundreds of millions of dollars to claimants who chose to participate. While it provided financial restitution for many, critics noted that civil compensation is not the same as full public trial accountability. Infrastructure also extends into financial systems. Investigative reporting revealed that large sums moved between accounts tied to property management companies and offshore structures. Financial institutions faced scrutiny over their relationships with him, particularly after earlier convictions. Some banks later paid fines or entered into settlements for failing to adequately monitor suspicious transactions. These regulatory actions highlighted systemic oversight gaps in the broader financial world. Beyond physical properties and financial flows, digital infrastructure became central after the 2019 arrest. Prosecutors stated in court that they had seized electronic devices containing substantial data. However, due to the defendant's death, a full criminal trial examining that material never occurred. That absence created a vacuum. Without a trial, evidence remains largely summarized in motions rather than tested in open court through cross-examination. For a public seeking detailed answers, that procedural reality proved frustrating. The Metropolitan Correctional Center itself became part of the infrastructure discussion. After his death, investigations revealed multiple failures within the facility. Guards did not complete required rounds. Cameras near the cell malfunctioned. Administrative oversights compounded the issue. The Department of Justice Inspector General later released reports criticizing conditions and staffing problems. 2 correctional officers were charged in connection with falsifying records, though charges were eventually dropped after they entered into deferred prosecution agreements. Institutional weaknesses, rather than elaborate plots, were cited in official findings, though public skepticism remained widespread. In the U.S. Virgin Islands, the territorial government filed civil lawsuits against the estate and financial institutions, arguing that local systems had been exploited. Those lawsuits alleged that companies connected to the financier misrepresented the nature of operations conducted on the island. Over time, substantial settlements were reached, channeling additional funds into local programs and restitution efforts. When analysts review such cases, they often emphasize that longevity requires structure. The existence of multiple properties, aircraft, and coordinated staff implies sustained planning. But it also means that many individuals may have interacted with the operation in limited, compartmentalized ways. A pilot may see flight manifests without knowing guest interactions. A groundskeeper may maintain property without access to interior rooms. Compartmentalization can limit awareness while preserving overall function. The role of social logistics should not be overlooked either. Invitations to exclusive gatherings create perceived prestige. Associations with academic institutions and public figures can normalize presence in elite spaces. Over time, repeated exposure reduces scrutiny. This social dynamic, documented in various witness statements, demonstrated how reputation can function as a shield. Yet infrastructure leaves records. Property deeds, corporate filings, aviation logs, payroll entries, banking transfers, all of these create paper trails. It was through these trails that federal authorities reconstructed aspects of the alleged operations. Even without a completed criminal trial, civil proceedings and investigative journalism pieced together significant details. One of the enduring questions following the release of documents and property records is how much oversight could have occurred earlier. Financial institutions are required under federal law to file suspicious activity reports when transactions appear unusual. Regulatory filings later revealed that some banks had indeed submitted such reports, though actions were not always immediate. The lag between suspicion and decisive intervention illustrates the complexity of white-collar oversight systems. As Session 2 draws toward its conclusion, the focus shifts from individual behavior to structural reality. Multiple residences, private aircraft, international connections, corporate entities, banking relationships, institutional interactions. None of these elements alone prove wrongdoing, but together they demonstrate scale. And scale matters in understanding how allegations could persist across years and jurisdictions. The properties have since changed hands. The Manhattan townhouse was sold. The island properties were listed and later transferred. Physical spaces that once dominated headlines now function as real estate assets once more. Yet their historical significance remains embedded in court records and investigative archives. Infrastructure tells a story not of sudden events but of continuity. It shows how systems can operate quietly, sustained by resources and reputation. It highlights how oversight mechanisms sometimes react slowly. And it reminds observers that complex cases are rarely confined to one location or moment in time. Session 2 ends with a broader realization. When examining allegations tied to power and wealth, the physical and financial architecture surrounding an individual can be as revealing as testimony itself. Buildings, bank accounts, aircraft, and institutional partnerships form the backbone of any sustained enterprise. Understanding that backbone is essential to understanding the full scope of the case. When investigators attempt to understand how influence operates at the highest levels of society, they rarely look at a single individual in isolation. Influence spreads through networks, through introductions, through donations, through shared conferences, through private meetings that never appear on public calendars. In this case, the question was never only about one financier. It was about how someone with a controversial past maintained access to elite institutions across decades. Court records, depositions, and journalistic investigations consistently described him as someone who cultivated proximity to power with deliberate precision. He did not merely attend social gatherings. He positioned himself as a connector. In elite circles, introductions can be more valuable than money. A recommendation can open doors that wealth alone cannot. And he appeared to understand that dynamic exceptionally well. One of the most documented aspects of his network involved academic institutions. Over the years, he donated significant sums to universities and research programs. Among the institutions later scrutinized for their ties were Harvard University and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Internal reviews at both institutions acknowledged that funds had been accepted even after his 2008 conviction, prompting public apologies and leadership changes. In some cases, universities pledged to redirect or return portions of the donations. These developments raised uncomfortable questions about donor vetting, ethical oversight, and how prestige can cloud judgment. The appeal of association was not one-sided. For ambitious financiers, being photographed with respected scholars and Nobel laureates creates legitimacy. For universities, access to donors capable of funding cutting-edge research can accelerate projects that otherwise struggle for resources. The intersection of these interests forms fertile ground for blurred boundaries. The documents did not prove that academic leaders were aware of alleged misconduct. Rather, they exposed how reputation management can influence institutional decision-making. The network extended beyond academia into politics and international affairs. Public records and previously released flight logs showed meetings with former officials, business leaders, and diplomats. It is important to note that appearing in a contact book or flight log does not equate to criminal involvement. Legal experts repeatedly emphasized that context determines meaning. Many individuals who had interacted with him publicly stated they severed ties once allegations became clear. Others maintained that their contact had been minimal or professional in nature. Still, patterns matter. Repeated appearances of certain names in different contexts drew scrutiny. Depositions from civil cases occasionally referenced introductions made at private dinners or gatherings. Some witnesses described environments where powerful figures moved comfortably without public oversight. The very exclusivity of those environments contributed to the perception of secrecy. Another central figure in the broader case was his longtime associate, later convicted in federal court for her role in facilitating abuse. Her trial provided the most detailed courtroom examination of the network's internal operations. Witness testimony described recruitment processes and household management structures. Prosecutors presented evidence that framed her as instrumental in maintaining logistics. The verdict, delivered after weeks of testimony, represented one of the few instances of criminal accountability connected to the broader allegations. But the network was not defined solely by criminal proceedings. It was defined by reputation, wealth, and the psychology of elite spaces. Sociologists often note that high-status environments create assumptions of credibility. When someone consistently appears in rooms filled with respected figures, observers infer legitimacy. Over time, that perceived legitimacy can override earlier warning signs. Financial institutions also became part of the institutional network. Major banks faced scrutiny for maintaining relationships with him after his earlier conviction. Regulatory investigations examined whether internal compliance systems had failed to adequately monitor transactions. Some institutions later reached settlements and paid substantial penalties. These actions did not allege that bank executives were involved in criminal activity. Rather, they focused on failures in oversight and reporting obligations. Corporate structures tied to his properties formed another layer. Shell companies, trusts, and offshore entities can serve many lawful purposes, including tax planning and asset management. However, in this case, investigators analyzed whether such structures obscured operational details. Civil litigation in the U.S. Virgin Islands argued that certain corporate entities facilitated misconduct by enabling property management and payments. The estate ultimately resolved several of these claims through negotiated settlements. Within political circles, the reaction was cautious. Few public figures offered detailed commentary beyond general condemnation of abuse and support for victims. The reluctance to engage deeply may have stemmed from legal prudence or from the complexity of the case itself. Allegations intersected with powerful names, but evidence varied widely in specificity. Public officials, aware of defamation risks, often limited statements to confirmed facts. The media landscape surrounding the network became its own battleground. Investigative reporters who had pursued the story for years revisited earlier attempts to publish findings. Some outlets acknowledged editorial decisions that, in hindsight, might have warranted reconsideration. The broader media ecosystem grappled with the balance between responsible reporting and the public's demand for transparency. Victims' advocates repeatedly urged observers not to lose focus. While the public debated high-profile associations, survivors sought acknowledgement and justice. Civil suits brought forward personal accounts that humanized what might otherwise be abstract discussions of power. These testimonies underscored the lived impact behind institutional analysis. The death of the financier in custody added further complexity. Without a full criminal trial, much evidence remained summarized in indictments and motions rather than tested in open court. For those seeking definitive narratives, that absence created frustration. Networks thrive on ambiguity. When legal proceedings halt prematurely, ambiguity expands. Yet the record continued to grow through civil litigation. Depositions became public in redacted form. Judges ruled on motions to unseal names. Advocacy groups monitored disclosures closely. Each release prompted renewed scrutiny of how relationships formed and persisted. A recurring theme across institutional reviews was compartmentalization. Within universities, only certain administrators interacted with donors. Within banks, compliance officers reviewed transactions separate from relationship managers. Within corporations, subsidiaries operated under distinct management structures. Compartmentalization can enhance efficiency, but it can also limit holistic oversight. When responsibility fragments, accountability can blur. Experts in organizational behavior describe this phenomenon as diffusion of responsibility. When many individuals contribute small pieces to a system, no single person feels fully accountable for its outcomes. Whether that dynamic played a role in this case remains debated, but the structural parallels are difficult to ignore. International dimensions further complicated the network. Properties and meetings spanned multiple countries. Legal cooperation across jurisdictions requires treaties and procedural coordination. Evidence collection may involve differing privacy laws. The cross-border nature of the network underscored how globalized wealth operates beyond any single regulatory framework. As more documents surfaced over time, one realization became unavoidable. Influence rarely appears dramatic in real time. It looks ordinary. It appears as dinners, conferences, research grants, and philanthropic announcements. Only in retrospect does a pattern emerge that prompts deeper questions. Session 3 concludes not with definitive accusations against every person who crossed paths with him, but with a broader reflection on systems of prestige. Elite networks are built on trust, reputation, and shared interests. When those networks intersect with alleged misconduct, disentangling association from accountability becomes legally and ethically complex. The documents released so far show connections. They show introductions. They show institutional responses after the fact. What they do not show, in most cases, is direct evidence implicating the majority of named individuals in criminal acts. That distinction is essential for responsible analysis. At the same time, the network's breadth explains why public curiosity remains intense. Because when a single individual moves so fluidly across academia, finance, politics, and international society, and later faces grave criminal allegations, the question naturally follows. How did so many doors remain open for so long? In the next session, the focus shifts inward to one of the most controversial chapters of the entire saga, the events surrounding his detention and death, and the investigations that followed. On July 6, 2019, federal agents arrested Jeffrey Epstein at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey as his private jet landed from Paris. He was charged in the Southern District of New York with sex trafficking and conspiracy. The case immediately reignited global attention, not only because of the allegations, but because it represented a second chance for federal prosecution after the widely criticized 2008 plea agreement in Florida. This time, prosecutors signaled that the case would move forward aggressively. Bail was denied. He was detained at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. The Metropolitan Correctional Center, commonly known as MCC, was a federal detention facility that had housed high-profile defendants before. But internal reports later described serious staffing shortages and operational challenges during that period. Shortly after his arrest, Epstein was placed in the Special Housing Unit, a more restrictive area often used for inmates requiring closer monitoring. Within weeks, reports surfaced that he had been found injured in his cell. Officials initially described the incident as a possible suicide attempt, though details remained unclear. On August 10, 2019, news broke that Epstein had been found unresponsive in his cell and was later pronounced dead. The official cause of death, determined by the New York City Medical Examiner, was suicide by hanging. The announcement triggered immediate shock waves. For supporters of the prosecution, it meant the end of a criminal trial that might have exposed extensive testimony in open court. For critics and skeptics, it sparked suspicion. Questions surfaced rapidly. Why had he been removed from suicide watch shortly before his death? Why were two correctional officers assigned to monitor the unit allegedly asleep and failing to conduct required rounds? Why did surveillance cameras outside the cell malfunction that night? Each detail intensified public doubt. The Department of Justice opened investigations into the circumstances surrounding the death. Then, Attorney General William Barr publicly described the failures as serious irregularities and pledged accountability. Subsequent findings revealed a troubling picture of institutional breakdown rather than a coordinated conspiracy. The Department of Justice Inspector General later released a detailed report citing chronic staffing shortages, excessive overtime, and administrative negligence at the facility. Correctional officers were accused of falsifying records to indicate they had completed required checks when they had not. In 2020, 2 officers were charged with conspiracy and falsifying documents. However, in 2021, prosecutors agreed to dismiss the charges under deferred prosecution agreements, requiring the officers to perform community service and comply with certain conditions. The malfunctioning cameras became one of the most controversial aspects of the case. Officials stated that the cameras covering the tier where Epstein was housed were not functioning properly that night. While other cameras in the facility were operational, the absence of clear footage from the immediate area fed widespread skepticism. Technical failures are not uncommon in aging facilities, but in this context, coincidence became fuel for public doubt. Independent forensic experts were also drawn into the debate. Epstein's legal team hired a private pathologist who questioned aspects of the autopsy findings. However, the official ruling of suicide remained unchanged. In the absence of a trial and cross-examination of evidence in open court, competing interpretations continued circulating in media and online communities. Public trust, already fragile after years of controversy surrounding the earlier plea deal, deteriorated further. Polls suggested that a significant portion of Americans doubted the official explanation. Social media amplified alternative theories at unprecedented speed. The narrative became less about documented evidence and more about perceived plausibility. In cases involving wealth and influence, suspicion often fills informational gaps. The death had immediate legal consequences. Under U.S. law, criminal proceedings generally terminate upon a defendant's death. The charges in the Southern District of New York were formally dismissed. For victims who had hoped to testify publicly, that outcome was devastating. A courtroom trial would have provided sworn testimony, cross-examination, and potentially additional evidence entered into the public record. Instead, the focus shifted to civil litigation and compensation programs funded by the estate. The estate established a victims' compensation program in 2020. Administered by an independent overseer, the program reviewed claims and awarded financial compensation without requiring participants to testify in court. By the time the program concluded, it had distributed hundreds of millions of dollars to claimants. While many victims expressed appreciation for the financial support, others emphasized that monetary compensation could not replace a public reckoning. Meanwhile, the federal government faced scrutiny over detention conditions more broadly. Reports described systemic issues at the MCC and other facilities: staffing shortages, infrastructure decay, and inadequate oversight mechanisms. Epstein's death became a catalyst for renewed calls to reform the federal prison system. Congressional hearings examined conditions within the Bureau of Prisons. Leadership changes followed, though critics argued that structural reform would require sustained political commitment. International observers also reacted strongly. Because Epstein's social network extended globally, his death resonated beyond the United States. In the United Kingdom, where one of his prominent associates had faced civil allegations, media coverage intensified. In France and the Caribbean, journalists revisited property records and travel histories. The case evolved from a domestic criminal matter into a symbol of institutional fragility worldwide. Legal scholars pointed out that skepticism toward official explanations often arises when transparency appears incomplete. In this instance, redactions in investigative reports, ongoing civil litigation, and privacy protections limited full public disclosure. Each necessary legal boundary unintentionally deepened suspicion. The balance between transparency and due process is delicate. Too little disclosure invites doubt, while premature disclosure can compromise legal integrity. The death also altered the trajectory of related prosecutions. His longtime associate, later convicted in federal court, faced trial without the possibility of direct testimony from him. Prosecutors relied on documentary evidence and witness accounts. The jury ultimately returned guilty verdicts on multiple counts. That conviction provided some measure of legal accountability, yet it did not satisfy broader public curiosity about the entire network. For many observers, the most lasting impact of the jail death was psychological rather than procedural. It reinforced a narrative that powerful individuals can evade full exposure. Whether that narrative reflects systemic corruption or systemic incompetence remains debated. Official investigations concluded that negligence and understaffing created conditions that enabled the suicide. They did not find evidence of homicide. Yet public opinion often diverges from official findings when trust has eroded. Media coverage in the months following the death oscillated between investigative reporting and cultural commentary. Late-night shows referenced the controversy. Documentaries were announced. Podcasts dissected timelines. The story became embedded in popular culture as shorthand for elite secrecy and institutional failure. As time passed, concrete legal actions replaced initial shock. Civil cases moved forward. Financial settlements were reached. Institutional reviews concluded. But the emotional intensity surrounding the jail death did not disappear. It became part of the broader narrative of unfinished accountability. Session 4 closes with a difficult acknowledgement. Regardless of official findings, the circumstances of the death permanently altered public perception of the case. A trial that might have clarified evidence never occurred. Testimony that might have been scrutinized in court remains locked in investigative files. Oversight failures were documented, but for many, documentation was not enough. The collapse of trust can be more enduring than the event that triggers it. In this case, trust in legal institutions, correctional systems, and elite networks suffered measurable damage. Restoring that trust requires more than reports. It requires consistent transparency over time. In the final session, the focus will turn to what remains unresolved: the ongoing civil litigation, the gradual unsealing of documents, and the broader legacy of the case within legal and political systems. When a criminal case ends abruptly, it does not truly end. Transforms. Courtrooms may fall silent, but civil litigation, document disputes, and institutional reviews continue moving forward in quieter ways. In the aftermath of Jeffrey Epstein's death, the focus shifted from prosecution to preservation of records, preservation of testimony, and preservation of claims brought by victims seeking accountability. One of the central developments after 2019 was the creation of a compensation program funded by Epstein's estate. The program was designed to provide financial restitution without requiring victims to endure lengthy public trials. Over time, it paid out hundreds of millions of dollars. For many participants, the compensation offered a measure of recognition. Yet the absence of a full criminal trial meant that much of the evidence remained summarized rather than publicly dissected in open court. Financial settlements can resolve legal claims, but they rarely satisfy the public's desire for narrative closure. Meanwhile, civil lawsuits continued across multiple jurisdictions. In the U.S. Virgin Islands, the territorial government pursued claims against the estate and associated entities, alleging that corporate structures facilitated operations on the private island. Those claims were eventually resolved through substantial settlements. Financial institutions also faced legal consequences. Some banks entered into agreements to pay significant sums after regulators concluded that compliance systems had failed to properly monitor transactions connected to Epstein's accounts. These settlements did not allege that banking executives were personally involved in criminal conduct, but they underscored systemic weaknesses in oversight. The unsealing of documents became a slow and highly contested process. Judges weighed privacy concerns against the public interest. Victims' identities were protected under court rules. Names of individuals mentioned in depositions were sometimes redacted pending review. Each new release reignited media attention. Pages were scrutinized line by line. Online communities analyzed every footnote, searching for patterns. It is important to understand what these documents represent. Depositions capture testimony under oath, but testimony reflects the perspective of the witness. Allegations recorded in civil filings are not automatically findings of fact. Courts differentiate between claims and proven liability. This distinction became increasingly important as public discussion intensified. Responsible analysis required separating confirmed judicial conclusions from unverified statements. Another layer of scrutiny fell upon institutions that had once maintained relationships with Epstein. Internal reviews were conducted at universities, foundations, and research centers. Among the most widely examined institutions were Harvard University and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, both of which acknowledged accepting donations connected to him. Leadership changes and policy reforms followed in certain cases. Universities tightened donor transparency standards and revised ethics guidelines. These changes reflected an attempt to prevent similar controversies in the future. The broader cultural impact of the case cannot be separated from the legal aftermath. Documentary series, investigative podcasts, and books continued exploring the timeline. Public fascination persisted not only because of the crimes alleged, but because of what the case revealed about access to power. Elite networks operate through introductions, shared interests, and private gatherings. When misconduct intersects with such networks, accountability becomes legally complex and socially explosive. One of the most significant legal milestones after Epstein's death was the trial of his longtime associate. Her conviction in federal court demonstrated that prosecution was still possible in certain contexts. The jury's verdict provided formal judicial findings based on presented evidence. Yet even that trial focused narrowly on specific charges and timeframes. It did not attempt to catalog every association or address every rumor. Criminal law is designed to prove particular counts beyond a reasonable doubt, not to resolve all public curiosity. Questions about additional sealed materials continue to circulate. Grand jury proceedings remain confidential under federal law. Investigative files compiled by prosecutors are not automatically released to the public. Intelligence assessments, if any were conducted, would be subject to classification rules. These structural limitations are common in major cases, but in this instance they have fueled speculation. Legal experts often remind the public that sealed does not necessarily mean scandalous. It frequently means sensitive. Witness protection, privacy rights, and due process considerations require redactions. Yet in high-profile cases, secrecy can appear suspicious. The tension between transparency and legal protection has defined much of the post-2019 debate. Political ramifications also linger. The case became a symbol in broader discussions about wealth inequality, prosecutorial discretion, and criminal justice reform. Lawmakers cited the 2008 plea agreement as an example of how prosecutorial decisions can have lasting consequences. Congressional hearings examined detention conditions within the federal prison system following Epstein's death. Oversight committees reviewed procedures related to inmate monitoring and staffing shortages. Financial regulators likewise reassessed compliance standards. Banks strengthened reporting protocols. Compliance departments expanded training on high-risk clients. While such reforms are not unique to this case, the public scrutiny accelerated implementation. Large institutions often respond most quickly when reputational risk becomes tangible. For victims, however, the long shadow of the case is personal rather than institutional. Civil settlements and compensation funds provide acknowledgement, but they do not erase trauma. Advocacy groups continue working to ensure survivor-centered reforms. The legacy of the case includes broader awareness about grooming tactics, exploitation networks, and the importance of reporting mechanisms within schools and community organizations. As years pass, the properties once associated with Epstein have changed ownership. The Manhattan townhouse was sold. The island in the U.S. Virgin Islands was listed and eventually transferred. Physical spaces evolve, but records endure. Court filings remain archived. Settlement agreements, even when confidential in detail, leave public traces. Regulatory actions become part of compliance case studies. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of the case is what it reveals about systemic vulnerability. Wealth can purchase privacy. Influence can generate deference. Institutions can fail to act decisively when reputational or financial interests are at stake. Yet the legal process, however slow, eventually compiles documentation. That documentation forms a permanent record. The remaining files, those still sealed or partially redacted, represent unfinished chapters. Some may never become public. Others may surface gradually through future litigation or investigative journalism. The law moves methodically, often frustratingly so. Appeals can take years. Civil disputes can stretch across jurisdictions. Patience is not easily sustained in the age of instant information. Session 5 concludes with a sober understanding. The Epstein case is no longer defined by dramatic arrests or shocking headlines. It is defined by institutional response, civil accountability, and cultural reflection. The absence of a final criminal trial leaves a gap in the historical record. But the combination of convictions, settlements, regulatory reforms, and document releases ensures that the case will remain studied for decades. It stands as a cautionary narrative about power, access, and oversight. It highlights how systems designed to protect can falter under pressure. It demonstrates that accountability can be partial yet still meaningful. And it reminds observers that transparency is rarely immediate. It unfolds in layers, often long after the initial event has passed. The files that remain may continue to surface in fragments. The debates may evolve. But the long shadow of this case will persist in law schools, compliance offices, and public discourse as an example of how complex the intersection of wealth, influence, and justice can become.